Marina Heights stood as a glittering jewel along the rugged coastline, its glass and steel mansions clinging to the cliffs like monuments to wealth. At the heart of this opulent community was Vivian Hale, a 52-year-old biotech tycoon whose life was defined by power, ambition, and a need for control. As the CEO of Neuralink Innovations, Vivian had built her fortune through innovation and cutthroat business tactics, pioneering brain interface technology that had put her at the forefront of medical advancements. Her empire, sprawling and vast, had made her rich beyond imagination, but it had also left her deeply isolated. After 3 failed marriages, Vivian had decided that love was just another transaction. She no longer sought companionship in equals, instead preferring to mold younger men who offered her fleeting intimacy and complete control. Her relationships had become strategic, beautiful, malleable men who relied on her for wealth and status, and who were expected to give her the adoration she craved. That was how she met Ethan Walker, a 22-year-old art school dropout from rural Ohio. Ethan was everything Vivian desired in a companion: young, attractive, and emotionally pliable. Growing up in a modest household, Ethan's parents had struggled to make ends meet. His father was a factory worker, and his mother taught elementary school, barely able to support their son's passion for art. When Ethan finally made it to college on a partial scholarship, the pressure of balancing work, school, and his family's expectations eventually crushed him. By the end of his second year, he had dropped out and drifted to the West Coast in search of a fresh start, working odd jobs to survive. Vivian first spotted Ethan at a high-end gallery, where he was working as a server. She was immediately taken by his boyish good looks and quiet demeanor. To Ethan, Vivian was a force of nature, sophisticated, powerful, and capable of providing him with a life he could never have imagined. She showered him with gifts, moved him into the guest house of her mansion, and introduced him to a world of luxury and privilege. In return, Ethan played the part of the doting young lover. At first, it seemed like the perfect arrangement, but over time, the cracks began to show. Vivian's controlling nature became suffocating. She tracked his movements, monitored his phone, and subtly manipulated every aspect of his life. What had once been thrilling now felt like a gilded cage, and Ethan's sense of self slowly began to erode under her oppressive control. It was in the midst of this growing discontent that Ethan met Isla Bradford, a 22-year-old art history major, working part-time as a docent at the Marina Heights Museum of Art. She was vibrant, with a passion for creativity that reignited something in Ethan that he hadn't felt in years. Isla was different from Vivian in every possible way: open, free-spirited, and kind. Their relationship blossomed over shared coffees and late-night conversations about art. And it wasn't long before their connection turned into something far deeper and far more dangerous. Ethan began sneaking out to see Isla, slipping away from Vivian's watchful eye. For a time, he felt alive again, as though he were reclaiming the pieces of himself that had been buried beneath Vivian's controlling grasp. But freedom came with a price. Vivian was a woman used to having everything, and her suspicions about Ethan's increasing absences soon consumed her. She hired a private investigator, watched his movements, and uncovered the truth. Ethan had betrayed her. For Vivian, this wasn't just a personal affront. It was a direct challenge to her control, and Vivian wasn't someone who lost control easily. On the night of December 12th, the winds along the coast howled, crashing against the cliffs below as a storm raged outside. Ethan had returned home late, after another secret meeting with Isla, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of escape. He had grown tired of the opulence that had once seduced him. The luxury that Vivian had offered now felt like chains, and he was desperate to break free. As he entered the mansion, the house was dark and silent. Only the faint glow from the fireplace flickered in the distance. He hadn't expected Vivian to still be awake, but as he walked further into the living room, his stomach dropped. Vivian was sitting in the shadows, her figure illuminated only by the dim firelight. In her hand was a glass of red wine, but her grip on the stem was tight, as though it might shatter at any moment. "Where were you, Ethan?" Her voice was calm, too calm. Ethan hesitated, his heart racing. "I was out. I needed some air." "Air," she repeated, her voice dripping with venom. She rose slowly from the chair, and as she stepped into the light, Ethan saw something dark and dangerous flicker in her eyes. In her other hand, she held a long, sharp kitchen knife, the blade gleaming in the firelight. "Don't lie to me." "Vivian, put the knife down," Ethan said, taking a step back, his pulse quickening. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. Vivian's lips curled into a cold, twisted smile. "You think I don't know?" Her voice cracked as she took another step forward, the knife gleaming in her hand. You've been with her, haven't you? You thought you could humiliate me, betray me." "Vivian, stop," Ethan said, his voice trembling now. He backed up, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in around him, and there was no escape from the looming danger. "We can talk about this." But there would be no talking. With a sudden scream, Vivian lunged at him, slashing the air with the knife. Ethan barely managed to dodge the blade, stumbling backward as she advanced on him with wild eyes. She swung again, and this time the blade grazed his arm, tearing through his shirt and skin, leaving a trail of blood behind. Panic surged through Ethan as he grabbed a nearby lamp, swinging it wildly at her to fend her off. The lamp shattered against her shoulder, but it only seemed to fuel her rage. Vivian's face contorted in fury as she closed in on him, slashing wildly with the knife. In a desperate attempt to defend himself, Ethan reached for her wrist, trying to wrestle the knife from her grip. But Vivian's grip was iron. She fought like a woman possessed, snarling through gritted teeth as they grappled for control of the weapon. Ethan felt his back slam against the cold marble counter of the kitchen island. His strength was fading, and the blood from the gash in his arm was making him lightheaded. With one last, desperate shove, he managed to push her away. But Vivian was relentless. She came at him again, this time with the knife aimed directly at his chest. In the heat of the struggle, Ethan twisted her arm with all his strength, and the blade turned in her hand. There was a sickening moment of silence before the knife plunged deep into Vivian's abdomen, her own momentum driving it into her body. Vivian's eyes widened in shock, her breath hitching as the reality of what had just happened sank in. She gasped, her hand still gripping the handle of the knife, as blood began to seep through her silk blouse, dark and heavy. Ethan staggered back, horrified by what had just happened. He watched as Vivian stumbled, her hand weakly clutching at the wound in her stomach. Blood poured from her, pooling on the floor beneath her feet as she collapsed to her knees, the knife still embedded deep in her flesh. She looked up at Ethan, her face pale and contorted with pain, her breath coming in shallow gasps. You did this," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. Her body convulsed as blood gushed from the wound, soaking the expensive marble floors in a dark crimson pool. Vivian's eyes glazed over, her body twitching violently before she collapsed completely, face down in the blood. Ethan stood frozen, his chest heaving, his hands trembling, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Vivian Hale, the woman who had controlled his life so completely, was dead by his hand. The cold, lifeless figure lying in a pool of her own blood was a far cry from the powerful, untouchable woman she had once been. The knife gleamed in the dim firelight, still buried deep in her body, the handle slick with blood. The house fell silent. The storm outside raged on, but inside there was only death. Ethan stood in the eerie stillness of the mansion, his mind numb as he stared at Vivian's lifeless body. The blood had pooled around her like a grotesque halo, soaking into the once pristine white marble floor. The only sound now was the relentless pounding of his heartbeat in his ears, louder than the howling wind outside. He had to think, he had to act, but his body wouldn't move. The scene in front of him was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. His hands shook uncontrollably, still sticky with blood, and his vision blurred as the weight of what had happened crashed over him. Vivian Hale, the woman who had controlled his life for so long, was dead, and it was his fault. Ethan took a staggering step back, nearly slipping on the blood that coated the floor. His breath came in shallow gasps, panic tightening its grip on his chest. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of here. The police would never believe this was an accident, not with the way their relationship had been. He had no doubt that Vivian's connections and power would be used against him, even in death. He looked around the mansion, his mind racing. The house was full of cameras, hidden security systems Vivian had installed to monitor him. Everything that had happened could be on tape, captured by her obsessive surveillance. His heart pounded harder as the realization hit him. He had to destroy the evidence. With trembling hands, Ethan ran to the living room, where Vivian had kept her private security system. He found the hidden console beneath the desk, hastily pulling at wires and smashing the devices with a heavy paperweight. His hands fumbled, slick with blood and sweat, but he'd managed to rip apart the hard drive, watching it spark and crackle before it finally went dark. But destroying the cameras was only one part of the nightmare. Vivian's body still lay sprawled on the floor, the blade of the knife glinting dully from the pool of blood that had soaked into her once immaculate silk blouse. He had to leave. Now, Ethan stumbled toward the door, grabbing his jacket as he bolted into the night. The cold wind lashed against his skin, and the sound of the crashing waves far below seemed to echo his racing thoughts. His car was parked in the driveway, but even as he slid behind the wheel, his mind was a blur of terror. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away from this place. As the car roared to life, he sped down the winding roads of Marina Heights, the headlights cutting through the fog. Every turn seemed sharper, more dangerous, as though the landscape itself was conspiring against him. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and every glance in the rearview mirror sent a jolt of fear through him. The morning after Vivian's death, the tranquility of Marina Heights was shattered when her housekeeper, Elena Garcia, arrived at the mansion for her usual morning duties. Elena had worked for Vivian for years, and though she had always kept a polite distance from her employer's private life, she had noticed the strange tension between Vivian and Ethan in recent months. But nothing could have prepared her for what she found that morning. The mansion was eerily silent when she entered through the back door, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. As she moved closer to the living room, the smell hit her first, the sharp metallic scent of blood. Her heart leaped into her throat as she rounded the corner and saw it. Vivian Hale, lying face down in a pool of blood, the knife still buried deep in her abdomen. Elena screamed, dropping the basket of laundry she had been carrying. Her mind raced, but she knew what she had to do. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911. Within an hour, the Marina Heights Police Department arrived at the scene, led by Detective Lydia Monroe, a no-nonsense investigator with years of experience in homicide. The mansion, now a crime scene, was a far cry from the pristine estate it had once been. Blood stained the floors, and the shattered security system told a clear story. Someone had tried to cover their tracks. Monroe surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. Vivian Hale's death was brutal, but what intrigued her more was the missing boyfriend. Ethan Walker, the young man who had been living with Vivian for over a year, was nowhere to be found. His car was missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. The fact that the security system had been destroyed only deepened Monroe's suspicions. "Start canvassing the neighborhood," Monroe barked at her team. "I want every security camera within a 5-mile radius checked. We need to find out where this kid went." As the forensic team began their work, Monroe noticed the empty wine glasses on the floor next to Vivian's body. The half-full glass of red wine told her something. This wasn't a sudden break-in. Whoever killed Vivian had been close to her, had been drinking with her. This was personal. As the day wore on, news of Vivian Hale's death spread quickly through the media, and her high-profile status ensured that the investigation would be under a microscope. Reporters descended on the quiet streets of Marina Heights, eager for any morsel of information about the mysterious death of one of the most powerful women in biotech. Ethan had driven for hours, pushing him to the edge of exhaustion. By the time he reached the outskirts of Santa Clara, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a dull gray light over the deserted streets. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, but he ignored it. He knew it was Isla. He had sent her a frantic message before leaving, but there was no explaining this, not yet. He parked his car in a quiet, rundown motel off the highway, checking in under a fake name. His hands were still shaking as he handed the clerk a wad of cash, avoiding eye contact. Once inside the room, Ethan collapsed onto the bed, his mind racing. The blood on his clothes had dried, but the sight of it sent waves of nausea through him. He couldn't stay here for long. He knew that the police would be looking for him, and it wouldn't take long for them to track him down. He needed to figure out what to do next. He needed a plan, but all he could think about was Vivian, lying there in a pool of blood, her eyes wide with shock. It wasn't supposed to end like this. As he sat in the dark motel room, the weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him. Vivian had been controlling, manipulative. She had twisted him into someone he barely recognized, but he hadn't wanted her to die. Not like that. The phone buzzed again. This time Ethan picked it up, his fingers trembling as he answered. "Ethan," Isla's voice came through, frantic. "Where are you? I saw the news. They're saying Vivian's dead and you're missing. What happened?" Ethan's voice cracked. He didn't know what to say. How could he explain it? How could he tell her that he had killed the woman who had given him everything, even if she had also taken so much away? "I need help, Isla," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll come get you," she said quickly. "Tell me where you are." Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to drag her into this. She had nothing to do with Vivian's death, but he couldn't do this alone. "Okay," he finally said, giving her the name of the motel. When Isla arrived at the motel, her heart sank at the sight of Ethan. He looked pale and exhausted, his clothes stained with dried blood. She rushed to his side, her eyes wide with worry. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind reeling. "It was an accident. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Ethan, the police are looking for you," Isla said, her voice soft but urgent. "They think you killed her." "I did," Ethan whispered, the weight of the admission crushing him. But it wasn't supposed to happen like that. She came at me with a knife. I tried to stop her, and she... His voice trailed off as the memory of that night replayed in his mind. The struggle, the knife, the blood. Isla looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and sympathy. "We need to go to the police. You need to tell them what happened." "They won't believe me," Ethan said, shaking his head. "Vivian had connections. She had power. They'll pin this on me, no matter what I say." Isla took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew Ethan wasn't a murderer, but the situation was spiraling out of control. If they ran, it would only make things worse. But Ethan was right. The police wouldn't take his word at face value, not after everything that had happened. Before she could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door. Both of them froze, their hearts pounding in unison. "Ethan Walker, open up. This is the police." Ethan's blood ran cold. The room seemed to shrink as the pounding on the door grew louder. Ethan's heart raced. Every second felt like it stretched into an eternity. Isla's face was pale, her eyes wide as she stared at him, silently asking the question he had no answer to. "What now?" "Ethan Walker, open the door," the officer shouted again, his voice thick with authority. They weren't going to wait much longer. Ethan's mind was a whirlpool of panic and regret. Running now would only confirm his guilt, but opening that door would seal his fate. He wasn't ready to face it. He wasn't ready to face what he had done. "Go hide in the bathroom," Isla whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible. "Trust me, Ethan." "What?" he stammered, the confusion momentarily knocking him off balance. "Just do it," she insisted, already moving toward the door. "I'll stall them." Ethan hesitated for a heartbeat before slipping into the small bathroom, closing the door behind him as quietly as he could. His hands shook as he locked the door, his mind racing. He pressed his ear to the door, trying to hear what was happening outside. Isla took a deep breath and opened the door just enough to look out. Two officers, their faces stern and unyielding, stood on the other side. "We're looking for Ethan Walker," the officer said. "We know he's here. Step aside." I haven't seen him," Isla lied, her voice trembling just enough to seem convincing. "He texted me earlier, but when I got here, he was gone. Please, I'm worried about him." The officers exchanged a glance, their suspicion palpable. "We need to take a look inside," one of them said, already pushing the door open further. Isla stepped back, trying to maintain her composure. "You won't find anything, I'm telling you. He's not here." The officers brushed past her, their eyes sweeping the small motel room. Ethan's heart raced as he pressed himself into the corner of the bathroom, praying they wouldn't find him. He could hear their footsteps, slow and deliberate, as they searched the room. "Bathroom's locked," one of the officers said, his voice muffled through the door. A wave of panic crashed over Ethan. They were going to open it. This was it. This was the end. The door rattled as the officer knocked. "Open up. Now." Ethan's mind raced, trying to think of something. Anything that could get him out of this. His body tensed, every muscle ready to act, but he knew it was hopeless. The officer's knock came again, louder this time. Then, as if by some miracle, a voice crackled over the officer's radio. "We've got a sighting of Walker's car heading east on the interstate," the voice said. "Suspect might be heading out of state." Both officers paused, their eyes narrowing as they exchanged another glance. "Damn it," one muttered. "Let's go." Ethan's heart stopped as he listened to the officers rush out of the room, their footsteps fading into the distance. Isla closed the door behind them, her breath ragged as she turned toward the bathroom. "It's clear," she whispered, knocking softly on the door. "You can come out." Ethan unlocked the door and stepped out, his face pale and his body trembling. "They're gone," Isla said, trying to keep her voice calm. "But they'll be back. We don't have much time." Ethan collapsed onto the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands. "What the hell am I supposed to do now?" he muttered, his voice thick with despair. "They're going to catch me, Isla. It's over." "No, it's not," Isla said firmly. She knelt down in front of him, placing a hand on his knee. "We can still figure this out. We just need to get you somewhere safe." "Safe?" Ethan scoffed, his voice rising. "There's nowhere safe. I killed her. It doesn't matter what happened. I'm done." Isla stared at him, her eyes full of sympathy, but her mind was already working. "We'll figure this out, but you need to stay calm, okay? Let me think." Ethan looked up at her, the exhaustion and guilt etched into every line of his face, but in that moment he had no choice but to trust her. As the sun began to rise, Ethan and Isla hastily packed up what little they had and left the motel. Isla insisted they head to an old cabin her uncle owned on the outskirts of a small town far from the coast. It was isolated, quiet, and hopefully out of the police's radar. For now, Ethan spent the drive in silence, staring out the window as the California landscape passed in a blur. His mind kept going back to Vivian. The moment the knife had plunged into her body, the way her eyes had widened in shock, the blood, the sound of her last breath. It was a memory that played over and over again in his head, haunting him. "Do you want to talk about what happened?" Isla asked cautiously, breaking the silence. Ethan shook his head, his jaw tightening. "What's there to talk about? I killed her." "But it wasn't that simple, was it?" Isla pressed gently. "You were defending yourself, right?" Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. "Yeah, I guess. But it doesn't change what happened. She's dead, and it's my fault." "You didn't want to kill her," Isla said softly, placing her hand on his. "You were trapped. She was controlling you. You didn't have a choice." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly wiped them away. "Maybe," he muttered, "but that doesn't make it any easier." They arrived at the cabin by nightfall. The place was old and run down, but it was secluded, surrounded by thick woods and miles away from the nearest town. It was the best hiding place they could hope for. For the next few days, Ethan and Isla laid low, avoiding any contact with the outside world. But the weight of what had happened continued to press down on Ethan, crushing him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every moment he wasn't thinking about Vivian's death. He was thinking about the police, about how they were getting closer with every passing hour. Then one night, as they sat by the fireplace in the dark cabin, Isla finally broke the silence. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly, her voice trembling. Ethan looked up at her, frowning. "What is it?" I've been hiding something from you," Isla admitted, her hands shaking. "Something about Vivian." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Isla took a deep breath. "Before you met her, Vivian and we were involved." Ethan froze, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. "What do you mean, involved?" "I used to work for her," Isla explained. "Before I started at the museum, I was one of her assistants. But it was more than that. We were in a relationship." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I was scared," Isla whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Vivian she was manipulative, controlling. She did the same thing to me that she did to you. When I finally got away from her, I promised myself I'd never go back. But then I met you, and I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to lose you." Ethan stared at her, his mind reeling. Everything he thought he knew about Isla, about their relationship, felt like it was unraveling. "So, this whole time, you knew what she was like?" "Yes," Isla admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I knew, and I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how. I didn't want you to think I was still connected to her." Ethan shook his head, feeling betrayed, confused and angry all at once. "So what now? Are you here to help me, or are you just trying to save yourself?" "I'm here to help you," Isla insisted, reaching for his hand. "I swear, Ethan, I left her for a reason. I hated her just as much as you did. She ruined my life, and I didn't want her to ruin yours." Ethan pulled his hand away, his mind racing. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Everything felt like a twisted nightmare he couldn't wake up from. By the fourth night at the cabin, Ethan's paranoia had reached its peak. Every sound outside, every shadow in the woods, sent a jolt of fear through him. He hadn't slept in days, and the weight of everything, Vivian's death, Isla's revelation, was slowly driving him to the edge. Late that night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Ethan finally snapped. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered, pacing the cabin restlessly. "I can't live like this. They're going to find me. They're going to put me away for the rest of my life." "We'll figure it out," Isla said softly, but her words did little to calm him. "No," Ethan growled, his voice rising. "No, you don't get it. There's no way out of this. I'm done. My life is over." He stormed toward the door, but Isla grabbed his arm, trying to stop him. "Ethan, please, let go of me," Ethan yelled, yanking his arm away. But as he did, Isla lost her balance, stumbling backward. Her head slammed into the corner of the wooden table with a sickening thud, and she crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He stared down at Isla's motionless body, panic flooding his mind. No, 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 please, God, no. He rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he checked her pulse. She was still breathing, but barely. Blood trickled from the gash on her forehead, staining the floor beneath her. Ethan's heart raced as he realized what he had done. It was happening all over again. First Vivian, and now Isla. He was a monster. He was cursed. Tears streamed down his face as he knelt beside her, his hands covered in her blood. I'm so sorry, Isla, he whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't mean to. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows as Ethan sank to the floor, consumed by guilt and despair. There was no escape from this. There was no running from what he had become. Ethan couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The weight of his actions, first Vivian's death, now Isla's injury, was crushing him. He knelt next to her unconscious body, his fingers trembling as they pressed against the small pulse he could still feel in her neck. The sight of the blood pooling on the cabin floor made his stomach churn. I didn't mean to, he muttered under his breath, rocking back and forth on his knees, his mind spinning with guilt and fear. He had sworn to protect Isla, to never let her get hurt because of him. Now it felt like the world was closing in around him. The wind outside screamed against the cabin's wooden walls, the storm from the ocean crashing ever closer. But it wasn't just the storm that was coming for him. Ethan could feel it in his bones. Time was running out. The police had been close at the motel, and it wouldn't take long for them to follow the trail to this remote cabin. They'd find him, and this time, there'd be no escape. Ethan stood shakily, glancing around the small cabin. His mind raced with desperate thoughts. Maybe he could still run. Maybe he could find somewhere even more remote. But the thought of leaving Isla behind, bleeding and unconscious, twisted something inside of him. He couldn't just abandon her, not after everything. He moved toward the door, his hand gripping the knob tightly. But before he could turn it, a sound outside stopped him cold. Footsteps. For a brief second, he thought it might be his own mind playing tricks on him. But then he heard it again. Someone was out there, moving carefully through the woods. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He turned to the window, pulling back the thin curtain just enough to see out into the dark forest. Shadows moved between the trees, flashlights cutting through the stormy night. Then he saw them, police officers, slowly approaching the cabin. He backed away from the window, his mind screaming in panic. They had found him. It was over. The knocking on the cabin door echoed through the small room like a death sentence. Ethan felt the walls close in around him as the dread settled deep in his chest. Ethan Walker, this is the police. A voice called out, muffled through the heavy door. We know you're in there. Open the door and we can talk. Ethan's breath came in short gasps as he paced, his hands pulling at his hair in frustration. Isla still lay motionless on the floor, a thin line of blood tracing the wood beneath her. He couldn't leave her. But if he opened the door, they'd take him away, and everything would be over. Ethan, it's over. The officer's voice continued, calm but authoritative. We know what happened with Vivian Hale. We need you to come out now. Ethan's mind was spinning. They knew everything. The security footage might have been destroyed, but there had to be something else. Someone else. And now they were here, ready to drag him away to face the consequences of the nightmare he had created. He glanced at the knife in the kitchen, the one that had ended Vivian's life. For a brief, horrifying moment, his mind flickered with thoughts of ending it all right there. A way out, a way to escape the crushing guilt and the inevitable punishment that was waiting for him. But then his eyes fell on Isla again, her pale face, her chest rising and falling slowly. He couldn't abandon her like that. He couldn't let her die. If there was still a way to save her, he had to take it. The pounding on the door grew more insistent. Ethan, this is your last chance. Open the door, or we're coming in. His thoughts spun, desperately searching for any way out of the suffocating situation. The storm outside was still raging, the wind howling like a wild beast against the walls of the cabin. But inside, the tension was even thicker, an unbearable silence waiting to be shattered. Okay, Ethan yelled, his voice cracking. Okay, I'm coming out. He glanced at Isla one last time, then wiped the blood from his hands onto his shirt. His legs shook as he moved toward the door, every step feeling like he was dragging himself closer to the edge of a cliff. With trembling hands, he unlocked the door and opened it, the freezing night air rushing in and slapping him in the face. Outside, the beam of flashlights blinded him, and the sight of several armed police officers made his knees almost buckle. Step outside slowly, Ethan. one of the officers commanded, his voice calm but firm. "Hands where we can see them." Ethan raised his hands above his head, stepping out into the pouring rain. His body felt weak, his movements sluggish. The rain soaked through his clothes, mixing with the blood already splattered across his shirt. "It's over," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible as they slipped out. Two officers moved forward, gripping his arms tightly and pulling them behind his back. The cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrist, and a wave of defeat washed over him. There was no more running, no more hiding. "Is there anyone else inside?" one of the officers asked as they led him away from the cabin. "Yes," Ethan choked out. "Isla. She's hurt. She's inside. Please, help her." The officer nodded and motioned to his team, who immediately rushed inside to find Isla. Ethan's chest heaved as he watched them disappear into the cabin, the reality of what he had done settling into his bones. He had killed Vivian. He had hurt Isla. He had run and tried to hide. But none of it mattered now. It was all over. Inside the cabin, the officers quickly found Isla, still unconscious but alive. They called for paramedics, who arrived shortly after and began tending to her wound. As they carefully lifted her onto a stretcher, one of the officers approached Ethan, who was sitting in the back of a police cruiser, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. "Is she going to be okay?" Ethan asked weakly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "She's stable," the officer replied, his tone neutral but firm. "We're taking her to the hospital now." Ethan nodded numbly, his head hanging low. His body felt heavy, like it was sinking into the earth itself. The weight of everything he had done was crushing him, and there was no escape from it now. As the cruiser pulled away from the cabin, Ethan stared out the window, watching the dark forest fade into the distance. The road ahead stretched out like a long, lonely corridor, leading him toward a future he couldn't escape. He knew what was waiting for him: trials, headlines, a life behind bars. But in that moment, as the rain continued to fall, there was a strange sense of relief washing over him. It was over. The running, the guilt, the terror, it was all over, and in some twisted way, that felt like a release. Epilogue: A Reckoning. The news of Vivian Hale's death sent shockwaves through the biotech industry and the world beyond. Her empire, once unshakable, crumbled under the weight of scandal and tragedy. Reports flooded the media, painting Ethan Walker as a troubled young man who had been driven to madness under the suffocating control of the wealthy mogul. But the truth was never quite that simple. The trial was quick, and the evidence overwhelming. Ethan's confession, combined with the testimonies of those who had known Vivian and her manipulative tendencies, painted a picture of a toxic relationship that had spiraled into violence. The defense argued that Ethan had acted in self-defense, but the jury found him guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The sentence was severe: 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. Isla recovered from her injuries, but her life was forever changed. She disappeared from public view, moving far away from Marina Heights, trying to rebuild her life in the shadow of the tragedy that had engulfed her. She never spoke to Ethan again after that night, and the memories of their time together became little more than scars she carried with her. As for Ethan, he spent his days behind bars, replaying the events of that fateful night in his mind. The faces of Vivian and Isla haunted him, their eyes watching him from the corners of his cell. The years stretched ahead of him, a reminder of the choices he had made, the life he had destroyed. But in the end, it wasn't the prison bars or the sentence that trapped Ethan. It was the guilt, the knowledge that no matter what he told himself, no matter how many times he tried to justify it, he had killed her, and there was no escape from that.